Well, since there are other events on tonight's political viewing agenda that people might want to take a look at, we'll try to get underway and get started. I don't want to portray us as an undercard, but there are certainly other things to come tonight. So good evening and welcome to this evening's public forum on school funding and property taxes, two issues that are certainly going to be on the mind of voters throughout New Hampshire as they cast their ballots this fall, but are also quite likely to be near the top of next year's legislative agenda as well. My name is Jeff McClinch, and I'm the project director of the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project, a nonprofit advocacy organization that seeks to inform the public about the system the Granite State uses to fund its public schools and to advance reforms to make that system more equitable and sustainable. I'll serve as your host and moderator for tonight's forum, and that forum is going to consist of three parts. First, I'll begin with a brief overview of New Hampshire's school funding system and some of the problems now before it. Following that overview, we'll be joined by the former chair of the Derry School Board, Dan McKenna, who's also served as a former member of the Derry School Fiscal Advisory Committee, and he'll offer his perspective on how the shortcomings of New Hampshire's school funding system affect his community. Next, we'll hear from candidates from Rockingham County for the New Hampshire House of Representatives and Senate who wish to be recognized to offer their own remarks on school funding. I'll recognize everyone in alphabetical order, and given the number of folks who have indicated that they want to speak, I do ask that people try to limit their remarks to 2 minutes. I know that's a challenge, but just to be fair to everyone, I hope we can comply with that. And finally, we'll open the floor to questions from the public for the candidates who are here tonight. We received a few questions along with folks' registrations for the event, so we'll aim to ask those first. But if anyone who's in attendance would like to pose a question to the candidates, please go ahead and enter it via the Q&A feature on the screen, and we'll try to pose those as time allows. Now, before I make a few introductions of everyone who's here and get things underway, I do want to mention a pair of logistical items. First, all of the non-candidate attendees will be muted throughout the duration of the forum, unless we have time to take direct questions from the audience at the conclusion of the event. And second, I do want to remind everyone that tonight's event is being recorded, and we'll share that recording with each of you once the event's over, or maybe in a day or two, depending on workflow. But then we'll also post it to the School Funding Fairness website so that those who are unable to attend will still be able to hear what everyone has to say. So with that out of the way, I do want to just introduce the candidates who registered to take part this evening, and we'll start with our candidates for Senate. We have with us Joshua Borden from District 19, as well as Rebecca Perkins-Quokka from District 21. And I do want to say in advance, please accept my sincere apologies for any mispronunciations I may make. I know people are take great pride in their names, and I would like to get them correct, but I'm not always able to do so. So I apologize for that. In terms of House candidates, we have Nancy Bishop from District 14, Michael Cahill, District 17, Tom Chase, Rockingham 1, Sarah Dillingham from District 8, Ellen Douglas from Rockingham 10, Edward Duncan from District 18, Catherine Harake, my apologies if that's incorrect, from Rockingham 21, Diane Collifrath from the 3rd District, Kirsten Larson Schultz from 22nd Rockingham, Sean Lewis from Rockingham 8, also from Rockingham 8, Donna LaRanger, Liz McConnell from 11, David Muse from 29, Russ Norman, Rockingham 4, Valerie Roman, Rockingham 7, Jennifer Scrafford from Rockingham 19, Alexis Simpson from Rockingham 36, Joanna Signori, and again, that's one of the names I wish I could get correct. She's from Rockingham 19, Rockingham 7, Erin Spencer from District 6, Maureen Tebow from Rockingham 8, Trish Tidd from Rockingham 13, Mary Till from the 6th District, Eric Chur from the 33rd District, and Diana West from Rockingham 12. Thank you all so much for being a part of tonight's event. And with that out of the way, I do want to acknowledge as well a member of the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project Board of Directors is with us tonight, John Tobin. Thanks so much for joining us, John. And if you'll bear with me for a moment, we'll get things underway here with a little bit of screen sharing. So we hope that tonight's forum will really foster a greater dialogue, an ongoing dialogue, and a greater understanding about New Hampshire's school funding system and the problems that plague it, because that system, in one way or another, really touches the lives of just about everybody here in the Granite State. And needless to say, that school funding system is of immense importance to New Hampshire students, represented here by a group of students from Berlin who put together this banner in their graphic arts class and took place in a local parade to draw attention to the problems facing their schools in recent years. This problem is also an issue, or the system as a whole is also important to New Hampshire's homeowners, renters, and businesses. For while they may understand the value of investing in their local schools, they are finding it more and more difficult to do so as property taxes place an ever greater strain on their budgets. Now, in any discussion about school funding, we at the School Funding Fairness Project think there are three issues that are important to keep in mind. The first are New Hampshire's constitutional responsibilities. The second is the role of property taxes in funding schools and the inequities that arise from that approach. And third is the enormous gap between actual school costs and state aid. And I do want to just turn to each of those very briefly. So first, with regard to the state's constitutional responsibilities. As I think many people here for tonight's forum are aware, there have been a number of court cases in recent years, a number of cases before the Supreme Court, stretching back over 2 decades. And those cases, beginning with the Claremont cases in the late 90s, really established 2 fundamental responsibilities for the state of New Hampshire. First, they established that the state has a duty to pay for the cost of a constitutionally adequate education for every K-12 public school student. And really that's been affirmed in the Londonderry case from 2006, which effectively said that anything that the state defines as a constitutionally adequate education, it has to pay for, just plain and simply stated. The second responsibility is that the taxes that the state of New Hampshire uses to pay for this education must have a uniform rate across the state. And the court has, really kind of underscored this for property taxes, establishing that it must be uniform in valuation and rate. And there shouldn't be any surprise to sort of single out property taxes in that way, because local property taxes are really the driving force behind education funding in New Hampshire. If you look at the 2018-2019 school year, what you see is that all told, about $3.3 billion in revenue flowed into local school districts. Nearly 73% of that total came from local property taxes, or 7 out of every $10. Now you might ask, well, why is there just this overwhelming reliance upon local property taxes? And really the answer is pretty straightforward. It's that New Hampshire contributes less to its public schools as a state than any of its counterpart states in the country. If you look at this graph here, what you see is that to the right, states like Hawaii and Vermont at the state level provide about 80% of total revenue for local school districts. In stark contrast on the left, New Hampshire provides close to about just 20% of that total. You only get up to about the 30% range if you were to include the statewide property tax there, but that's really relabeled local tax. It shouldn't count in this calculation. So you have a wide span among the states, but it's clear that New Hampshire provides less than anywhere else. And that reliance on local property taxes has only grown over the past decade. Here we see that in terms of the sources of revenue going to local districts, it's local taxation that has grown the most since 2008, to the tune of about $570 million. State adequacy aid has grown, very modestly during this time, but it's almost been offset by declines in other state sources like school building assistance. So the problem with relying on property taxes wouldn't be so great, or may not even be a problem, if it were the case that students were uniformly distributed throughout the state, and just as importantly, property values were uniform throughout the state. But as this table here demonstrates, that is clearly not the case. There is a wide disparity of property values throughout New Hampshire, and as a result, you end up with situations in which communities that have greater property values can impose far lesser tax rates for school purposes, and yet generate more revenue for that same purpose than, if you will, property poor communities. And just to give you an example, we'll look at Moulton Borough in the 2018-2019 school year. They had equalized value per pupil of about $7 million. So that really is just a way of trying to understand what kind of resources might be available to educate the kids in that community. Because they had comparatively high property values, they were able to use a school tax rate of under $4 per thousand that year, and yet generate more than $26,000 per pupil for education purposes. Compare that with someplace like Newport, which had much lower property values, only about $555,000 per student. They used much higher tax rates to the tune of about $15 per thousand. Yet what they were able to generate was only a fraction of what Molten Borough was able to do, just only about $8,300 per pupil. So this chart here, or this table here, tries to lay out a sort of more simplified explanation of how state aid is determined. And in the interest of time, I won't delve into the details too much, but I do want to focus your attention on the two rightmost columns. At the far right, which is headed actual spending per pupil, this is what these districts that we've selected here spend on average on each of their school kids. And this was for 2018, 2019. Just to the left of that, in the second to the far right column, headed adequacy per pupil, we see what the state says those districts should be able to provide an adequate education. So in the case of Derry, and we'll hear more from Dan in a minute about this, they pegged the cost of an adequate education at about $4,600 per student, well below what Derry was actually spending. And Derry isn't alone in that. All of these districts, and really all the districts across the state, saw a huge gap between what the state said it would cost to provide an adequate education and what they're actually spending. So to try to illustrate really the impossibility of trying to achieve that standard, we at the Funding Fairness Project worked with school officials in Pittsfield to try to answer the question, what would it take to get down to the state's supposed level of adequate funding? And so for that year, the state of New Hampshire said that in Pittsfield, an adequate education should cost about $2.7 million all told. Actual spending in Pittsfield that year was about $10.3 million. So what would you have to take out to get down to that lower figure? Well, I've got 3 pages worth of things here, and I won't read all of them, but as part of this exercise, we eliminated all art, musical, and physical education classes, all school nurses, some of the science teachers, eliminating all building and grounds maintenance, all foreign language courses, any field trips or athletic programs, all substitute teachers, all technology personnel and equipment. We got rid of the summer recreation program, all guidance personnel, all the librarians and media center staff. We eliminated any sort of office supplies and maintenance on the copier, you name it. And even after all those changes would have been made, you still were left with a total figure for spending of about $5.3 million. Still twice what the state said the cost of an adequate education was. To get down to that adequacy figure, and this is for Pittsfield, you would have had to cut half the teachers in that district and bring the student-teacher ratio up to 60 students per teacher. I think it's really pretty safe to ask how anyone can believe that that will provide an adequate education for the students of Pittsfield. And we feel confident we could replicate this exercise in many districts and see the same sort of really astounding results. So given what I presented tonight, it shouldn't come as much as a surprise that the most recent assessment that's been done of New Hampshire school funding system really affirms these inequities. The Commission to Study School Funding that's been meeting for the past several months received a draft report from a national research firm. And one of the key findings of that report is presented here, and I'll just read it. The state's current system for school funding is inequitable from both student and taxpayer perspectives. The districts serving the highest proportion of students who are economically disadvantaged spend less on average compared with districts serving the fewest such students. Moreover, the districts with the least property wealth per student impose the highest local education tax rates to be able to fund their children's education. So with that by way of background, I want to stop sharing, and I'll turn it over to Dan to offer his insights and sort of how this has played out in his experiences in Derry.
Thanks, Jeff. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, you're a little bit low. If you want to get a little closer to your mic or increase your volume.
Thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks for having me tonight. Being in Derry and being on the school board for the past 9 years, we're a little bit of a unique community in New Hampshire, given our size, but also I think we share a lot of the same challenges and the same struggles that other communities across Rockingham County face. And one thing that you said, Jeff, that I just wanted to highlight, because I think it's really important, is school funding and state school funding isn't just an issue that affects kids. It isn't just an issue that affects teachers or parents with students in the classroom, but it really affects everybody because of how it impacts property taxes and the large burden that school funding is on our property tax system and on property taxpayers because of the way our system is structured. And I really think, hopefully, as candidates who are here tonight and folks are out, that really stressing that point to your communities, that school funding isn't just about the schools. School funding at the state level is really about everyone in the community, is really an important piece to get out to folks. And in Derry, we like to think of ourselves as people rich, but we'll also acknowledge that we're property poor. Then that's why on your chart we were in there with low equalized assessed valuations per pupil, and makes it a struggle every year. On the school board, it seemed like every year when we started the budget process, we started off by saying this is the most challenging year that we've had. And it seems like every year is the most challenging year when you're talking about the schools and school funding, because as you all know, costs continue to go up as salaries go up, as health insurance costs go up, all those costs that are fixed costs in terms of utilities. And as we incorporate more technology into the classroom, that brings costs, increases our costs, and that school funding hasn't been keeping up and hasn't been moving up with those increased costs. So as we start, and as I'm sure you've seen in your communities, really as you start the budget process each year, the conversation really started with what can we cut? And I know communities like Derry and other property poor communities around the state, those margins of what can be cut are getting smaller and smaller each year, which is why education funding or creating budgets is becoming more challenging each year. Jeff, you had put up that list of things that would need to be cut in order to get down to that adequate education, or what's been defined as an adequate education by the state. And as you were reading that, those weren't really hypothetical cuts. Those were actually cuts that we face in our community, and I know from talking to other school boards around the state that other school boards are facing. As school boards, we're trying to be creative. We're trying to be think outside the box in terms of how we present budgets and how we put budgets together. But as you were going through that list and talking about cutting librarians, moving from full-time to part-time staff, not because our number of kids are going down, but just in order to try to cut funding, cut expenses, those are real conversations and real ideas that we did in Derry over the past few years. And I know our counterparts in your communities around the state are also dealing with. And it has an impact on our education. And we all try to put out the best education we can, but we know these cuts that are being forced to be made are having an impact on our education. And kindergarten, I think, is a great example. For the past few years in Derry, we had offered half-day kindergarten instead of full-day kindergarten. We had data in our district that showed that our full-day students outperformed our half-day students throughout the remainder of elementary school. And each year we talked about adding full-day kindergarten, but at the end of the day, it wasn't something we were able to add because of that increased burden on the tax rate. So we're dealing with a situation where we know we could be offering more options to our students. We're cutting classes, we're withholding classes from students in terms of offering half-day instead of full-day kindergarten. We're eliminating languages in our language programs, paring those back. And we're, school boards are forced to do that because of the burden that our residents, citizens, taxpayers are already paying. And I think going to that inequity of the situation across the state, it's difficult to go to a town budget meeting or present the budget at a school board meeting. And folks keep coming up and saying, look, at the town next door has a much lower school property tax rate. They have a lower property tax rate. They must be spending their money wiser. They must be not offering as many extra things that we offer in our town, when the situation, when the truth of the matter is that's not the case. Because of our reliance on property taxes, our assessed valuations being lower in Derry means we have a higher tax rate, even though we're spending less money on education. So while in Derry we may be spending less than our neighbors in communities around us, we still have that higher property tax rate just due to the equalized valuations per pupil and the fact that we have kind of less ability to raise funds, that we have to increase that property tax rate. And so, I think that's why it's really important to stress to folks that education funding is something that affects everyone in the community and not just those parents or not just those kids in the schools, because as if we can increase or find a way to make school funding more fair across communities, we can help reduce that property tax burden on those local taxpayers. And I think, not to repeat everything you said, Jeff, but the choices are becoming more difficult because we're having to make those cuts, and things like saying, gee, you got to cut teachers every year. We know our class sizes are growing. I think we're seeing that across the state as well. But we're making choices because of the burden that taxpayers face. And I think that taxpayers across the state support education. I know in Derry, I think the folks in Derry have been very supportive of our budgets over the years, but there's also a limit in terms of what people can afford to pay. And so districts and school boards have to be cognizant of that and making these cuts every year. But, so I'd really just want to kind of stress that point of encouraging folks to talk to their school districts, talk to their school administrators if you're elected or before you're elected, to kind of find out more about that budget process, because the cuts that are being made in programming and going to the legislative sessions and hearing the committee, hearing people testify to the committee. And before that, throughout the course of the year, you hear the same story from across the state about the challenges, the cuts that are being made. And due to basically the downshifting of that cost in the support that local taxpayers have to give to the community. And I think just the one other piece of that is, one thing that I know we've seen in Derry is we're often pushing off projects. It's a lot easier to not do a repair to a building or put off a utility upgrade than it is to cut a class or to increase class sizes. And one thing we see as a result of that is it increases our costs later down the road, because now maintenance projects have grown, the cost of maintenance projects have increased. And so in trying to continue to offer the best product to our students, we're pushing off capital costs, which end up costing taxpayers more in the long run. But I think those are some of the challenges that we're faced with because of the cost of education versus the amount of support and the amount of aid that we get from the state. So I'll stop there unless there's anything else in particular, Jeff, that you wanted me to speak to. But I really encourage folks to talk to the school districts and remember when you're talking to your constituents that it's not just a student issue or a teacher issue, but it's something that affects the whole community.
Dan, thank you so much. And thank you for your service to the children of Derry and for sharing those insights with us. We really appreciate it. So from there, we're going to open the floor to candidates, and we'll start again with Senate candidates. So that means Josh Borden, you're up first.
All right, Jeff, thank you so much for hosting this event, and it truly was an excellent presentation. And Dan, thank you as well for your service in fighting. I've had the pleasure of knowing you for some time, and you've always fought for adequacy funding and equitable education, and you've done a heck of a job. And I'll say to the people watching, I know there's a lot of familiar faces out there, that Dan is understating the turmoil that happens in our community. And the bottom line is many people, the everyday person, they really don't understand what's being presented tonight. So he's so right. It's so imperative that when we get out there and campaign and talk to voters, that we're doing our best to dumb it down in simplest terms and to explain, the importance of adequacy funding, equaling an equitable education, and taking it a step further and really having an opportunity to reduce our property taxes. I'll keep my statements brief. I want to say again, it's great to see so many leaders and familiar faces on this call. I truly think many of you will be elected and will be the reason why we finally solve this problem. Downshifting and a lack of leadership in Concord has caused the turmoil in my district. And, Dan's right when he talks about things being cut so far down to the bone that there's nothing left but to raise taxes, at least in dairy, to at least offer, the services at the schools and on the town side of things. I mean, we're at the bone, and what it leaves is people turning on each other, blaming the municipal government or the school board for spending money, and anything else gets cut, and is really going to impact our children and our staff, and it's unfortunate. And I guess I would say this is, Concord has caused this turmoil, and it's important that we elect leaders who get it. We fall short of the state's constitutional responsibilities, and I will do everything in my power to spread that message, and if I am elected, to ensure that each town and community is getting what's owed. And that's really all we're asking is, a fair shot, a fair shake, so there can be an equitable education for all families, especially, the ones in District 9s and some of the ones up north. I mean, it's tough. We can't take any more. So thank you again. And Dan, thank you for your service. You've done a tremendous amount.
Wonderful. Up next is Rebecca.
Thank you. And I'd like to echo Josh's thanks to everyone that's here. I know we probably have a lot of champions on this issue in the room. And so thank you for all your work to date. And thanks, Jeff, for hosting us. I am the state Senate candidate in District 21, which includes Portsmouth, Durham, Newmarket, Newfields, Madbury, Lee, and Newington. And so, we have education looms large in our district, and I think it looms large on everyone's mind these days. And so, I think talking to voters in our district, it's become clear that education really is the, it's the obvious error in how we fund our state and how we get our business done. And I think just from a moral perspective, from a humane perspective, and from an opportunity and planning perspective in the state, we really need to visit with how we're prioritizing our children and our future, and making sure that we're really investing in the long term in what our state can see as success. And so I know in my life, education has been a path to opportunity for me, and I wish that for all of our students, regardless of where they're located. I think if you look at the work of the Education Funding Commission that's been ongoing, I'm encouraged by some of the questions they're asking and some of the new thinking they're doing, and in making sure that they're highlighting some of the disparities you guys pointed out tonight, where our resource poor communities are getting the least spending, that results in a noticeable difference in achievement by the students in those districts, and that where you happen to be born in our state makes a difference in the education and the opportunity you'll have. So I think these are all really important things to be thinking about. And on top of it all, this year we need to make sure that our schools have funding for PPE, for different transportation, for barriers in the schoolrooms, for school nursing support, hazard pay, operating remotely, technology. So it's a huge challenge, and I hope to be elected to help support this cause and be part of a discussion really looking at how we can have a more equitable funding mechanism across the state, and then also to increase the amount of funding that the state is looking at. if you guys haven't had a chance to see the interim report issued by the commission, I'd encourage you to take a look at it. They're really, I think, doing some work on how, the adequacy formula is coming together. And so I think I'm hopeful for the results of their work and look forward to working with them and all of you here, hopefully, on some new solutions in 2021.
Thank you so much. Up next is Michael Cahill. Michael, you're muted.
There we go.
There you go.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you all for being here. Education not only touches the student and the parent, but it also touches the business community. Because if you don't have a workforce, an educated workforce, if you don't have people of working age who sometimes have children, you're not going to be able to attract the workforce that you need. You're not going to be able to have that next generation coming down the pipeline. And so it really affects everybody. And as you know, businesses, they pay property taxes twice. They pay for the home and they also pay for their business location. So the focus that they have, obsession they have with business profits tax and business enterprise tax is really misplaced. Property taxes are common enemy and we need to do something about it. And I hope that redirecting some of the state money to education will be a result of the commission. Here in Newmarket, we tried really hard to pass warrant articles. As you know, you had to get 60% of those voting to pass a warrant article to spend money to repair or renovate or replace your school. And we took it, I think it was 4 or 5 tries, and we finally got it. But when we did, there was no school building aid. So we spent $39 million and we're not getting a nickel from the state. This is unconscionable. 10 years now with no building aid. Well, they made a couple of exceptions in the legislature. Senator Khan got something for Hinsdale, and then in the last budget, there were a handful of schools that were really in bad shape that got some money. But we're not taking care of any retroactive. And Newmarket's not the only one. There, Hampton, there's Pelham. There's quite a few schools that couldn't wait for the building aid to be restored and had to go forward with the property taxes alone. So that's something I'm hoping will be addressed as well in the coming session. I also want to point out that the building aid program had some flaws. There were things that they tried. For a time, they were giving you an extra 5% of aid for every sending school. And that's been dropped, fortunately, because that was a bit of a boondoggle. And then now, if they have building aid money, they'll give the district 80% up front, which sounds great, except that doesn't leave enough money to do many schools. We have a couple of 100 schools that need work. And if you give somebody 80%, there's not enough for you to do another school, 2 other schools for what, another 10 years. Big problem. So we need to do something different with that. Kindergarten was brought up. In 1991, there was no kindergarten in Newmarket, not even half day. And Governor Shaheen signed the bill that we had kindergarten, I think it was the year later. And then Governor Sununu brought us full day kindergarten with not full day money, but half the money. And with Keno, that didn't really bring in all the money. So the legislature this year is now paying 100%. The kindergarten student will get the same funding that a first grade, second grade will get. That's progress, but we still need to find the resources to pay for it. So I'm going to let someone else have a turn. As you can see, education is a priority, and I wish that we had more representative candidates here to talk about it and to focus on it. There's a lot of other priorities, but education is certainly not to be ignored. Thank you.
Thank you. Up next is Ed Duncan.
Well, we're to the representatives. Thank you. And I have appreciated what everyone has said so far and of your presentation. And I have been going through this study that you have put or has been put out by the commission. And I am finding it very interesting. And also I intend to go a little further and look up some of the other websites it has. But by the way, I am a candidate for a representative in Exeter, and as I realize that there is a great need for changing things, it's going to be extremely hard this year And I'm afraid that no matter how we go about it or how it is going about, there's going to be difficulty in coming up with money for anything because of the cutbacks and the workforce that has been cut back. But in any case, as I understand this study and as I understand it, the need is to provide more money and to more equitably provide have the state provide support from changing the tax structure, which I understand would be having a more uniform evaluation across the state. Now, no matter how you go about this, everyone's still going to be doing it with with property tax. It's just that some of it will be more state property tax. But if they do it by reevaluating on a uniform basis, then towns that would normally be property poor may be charged at a higher rate because that will be considered equal with towns that are not property poor. And I think that that's something to consider. Other people were probably thinking that we need to go to what has been advocated for a state sales tax or a state income tax. Years ago, I worked for a part of a company that was out of Connecticut while I was working in New Hampshire, so it didn't directly affect me. I was off site. But I was working for them when Connecticut put in their state sales, their state income tax. And the promise was that we would lower the property taxes and lower other taxes when they do that. They not only didn't do that, the other taxes remained the same and they kept going up. And Connecticut is probably the highest tax state in New England, with maybe the exception of Massachusetts. I understand that this has happened in a lot of places where they have put in these other taxes, and that's not necessarily the solution, because when you have more money for a little while, then there's a temptation to spend more, and we need to control ourselves if we do that. I certainly see
I'm sorry to interrupt. If you wouldn't mind completing that thought so we can move on to other candidates. Perhaps we can return to some of your thoughts.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. All right. Well, I just hope that I really hope that we can come to some solutions, and I am glad that this study is being made, and I think they've done a lot of good work. And thank you for allowing me to speak.
Thank you. I believe Diane, you're next in the queue.
Hi, folks. I'm Diane Collifrath, and I'm running for House Representative in Rockingham District 3.
Diane, I'm very sorry. Are you able to increase the volume on your microphone or perhaps move a little bit closer to it?
Yeah, maybe I can sit a little closer. I'm not sure if I can increase my microphone.
There you go. That's helping. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm Rockingham District 3, so I'm Raymond, New Hampshire. I also was starting to delve into that AIR report that's been provided to the Education Committee, the Education Funding Committee, and that looks pretty hopeful in some of the proposals that they're making as far as taking some of the wealthier towns and taking the taxes that are generated for education, putting them back into the state-controlled hands, and then having a more equitable disbursement to communities that don't have such advantage to raising educational funds through property taxes, or pushing that burden onto taxpayers and then being limited by how much they can raise. So I'm hoping to learn a lot more about that and being able to champion that here in Raymond, where we have a pretty high per thousand tax rate, and schools that just basically are, crumbling, and again, programs that are being cut and slashed. So with a little luck, hopefully many of us, as Rebecca was saying, many of us will get into our our seats in Concord and be able to affect some of this change. I think there's a very persuasive and positive argument that's coming out of that AIR report that we can bring to our fellow citizens, right, our neighbors and our friends and family, that really kind of speaks to what we're seeing on even on our national level, where we have lots of people with deeper pockets who are kind of getting the lion's share of everything. So I think that it's a message that's going to resonate. So thank you.
Thank you. And we'll turn to Donna the Ranger next.
Hi, I'm Donna Loranger. I'm running for District 8, Rockingham, out of Salem. I come from a family of educators, so, you know, this topic is really near and dear to my heart, and I live in Salem, and my taxes continue to go up and up and up. We've enjoyed some, renovations to schools, which is great for the kids. However, you can tell that there's something wrong with how we fund, and this is just not sustainable. So the work that's being done, I think that's awesome. I do think, much what Ed had said earlier about the COVID effect, I think the next couple years are going to be really difficult for funding anything in New Hampshire. But it's the perfect time to lock this, how we do business going forward. It's the perfect time to lock this down and take these studies that we have and come up with a good plan and work with it, and with more public school positive people going to the legislature in 2021, it only adds to the base that we can move and come forward with solutions that will work, because as we all know, it's just not sustainable. And I don't understand why that's the part I'm having a tough time, is I don't understand how we got so far out of the realm of being able to fund schooling. So I look forward to working with you all when we all win, when we go to Concord and fix this, because it's not sustainable. And we actually need to pull New Hampshire out of that thought of business tax over everything. So that's my, I appreciate you letting me have a few minutes to
Oh,
talk.
absolutely. Thank you so much, Donna.
Yeah.
I think next is Valerie. Valerie, do you wish to speak tonight?
Sure. I'm Valerie Roman, and I live in Wyndham, and I'm running for House Rep for Rockingham District 7. And I'm speaking to the choir. I mean, I think that the reason why I'm running is I'm a public school and public education advocate, and I just feel that the trends are going the other way in terms of charter schools and religious schools and vouchers and all of this. And I just think, as Donna said, the funding model that has grown here has just been not effective and non-sustainable. And I just look forward and hope, coming from Wyndham, it's going to be very difficult as a Democrat to get elected, but I'm doing my best, and I'm hoping that I can, join in Concord and bring that public school advocacy and that problem-solving desire I have to work on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Alexis Simpson. Alexis, I think I lost track of you. There you are.
Here I am. Thank you so much for having us tonight. Can you hear me now?
You bet.
Great. I'm Alexis Simpson. I'm running for state rep this year in Rockingham County District 36. So that includes the town of Exeter, Newfields, Newmarket, and Stratham. I was a state rep in Exeter in 2015 and 2016. But as I was in the legislature and getting to know the state, I learned that education is very different from community to community here. And so again, running in 4 communities this year, I really have a sense of that. Before I ran for office, I was involved in sustainable food policy and advocacy. So I was more interested in school nutrition. and helped get the Farm to School program going here in Exeter. But before I left the legislature, I was focusing on the issue of fully funding full day kindergarten. So that was kind of where I was focused. And now I've just, since I'm running again, I've been trying to learn as much as I can about the about school funding, where it is right now. And like I said before, when I was in the legislature, I learned just the precarious nature of public school funding throughout the state. And in my opinion, it's really the struggle to ensure that all of our children are receiving an education that we can be proud of. And as a community leader, I feel really responsible for the well-being of all our children, not just my own neighbors. And so I've been trying to get up to speed on the work of the Commission on School Funding and just be really prepared to be an advocate for our children and our schools and our teachers when I get back to Concord, hopefully. If I'm elected in November, then I hopefully can work with all of you for more equity in our education system across the state.
Thank you so much. Next is Maureen Tebow.
Good evening. I'm Maureen Tebow, and I'm running for state rep from Rockingham District 8, Salem. Very tough place to run from, as Val in Wyndham can tell us. But what I wanted to say tonight is that the definition of an adequate education for all our New Hampshire kids is really in the sub-basement of what students need to succeed in school and beyond. And basing all of our school funding on property taxes is not fair, because as we've all seen, there are different levels of funding from town to town. And so the state, we as a state legislature need to come up with a better plan. We need to think outside the box, get away from the idea of everything being funded by the property tax. And if we do not want to go to an income tax or a sales tax, we need to find other streams of revenue. And I'm talking about
Maureen, I'm very sorry to interrupt.
new
You're having some problems with
things,
your audio.
perhaps, but with dedicated amounts of money, even if it's
Maureen,
2 cents
I'm
per
sorry to interrupt you. You're having some problems with the audio.
$100, whatever it is, to help adequately fund. Oh dear.
Maureen, if perhaps you turn off your video, that might improve your
I can't
audio.
seem to shake that issue.
Oops.
Yes.
Maureen, can you hear me?
Can you hear me better now?
There's still some problems a little bit. Why don't you give it a try, and then perhaps we'll come back to you.
Well, does that help at all? I can hear you. Yes.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Why don't you move forward?
Oh, I think we can hear you pretty well if you want to continue your thought.
Can you hear me?
You bet.
Why don't move forward?
Okay. Well, if you'd like to finish that up, just let me know. and
Okay.
We'll back to you. So-
we need to find new streams of revenue and dedicated.
Great. We're gonna move to Trish Tidd.
What? Move forward.
Yep.
Move forward.
Okay,
Yep, we can hear
can
you
you hear me?
very well.
All
Yep.
right, great. So hello, thank you, Jeff, for inviting me to this. To introduce myself, my name is Trish Tidd. I'm running for state representative in Rockingham District 13, which includes Kingston and Hampstead. So as an educator, I work at Manchester Community College. So I see the real life differences of what comes out of our school districts. The fact that a kid coming out of the Manchester School District or Franklin is really different than what comes out of Pinkerton or Londonderry. You know, how well they their command of the English language, their sentence structure, the experiences that they've had as far as like, you know, what they've been able to dissect or what they've experienced in their different classrooms. It is significantly different, and it puts some kids at a disadvantage. You know, the finish line at the end of my class, it doesn't have to be different, and my students get to the same place, but some of them have to work harder because of where they came from, and that's really not fair. I've also had the experience of working up in Claremont. I worked at River Valley Community College, so I saw the discrepancies even with even further away communities from Kingston and Hampstead. I also did have the experience and the opportunity to discuss this with Brian Stack, who is the principal at Sanborn High School. And one of the things that he said is the hardest, because of the emphasis that we put on property taxes, is the fact that it puts the town and the school at odds. You know, we should be fighting on the same side for our students, and instead we're on opposite sides because one side can't pay their taxes and one side can't fund education. And those two things, we need to find a solution. We also, I think, defining what is adequate, what is an adequate education, and actually getting a set definition for everything across the board of what is adequate is vital. You know, the differences between school districts is just so vast. Dan earlier brought up the idea of the capital improvements and making those the building improvements and how that gets put off. And it costs money down the road. The other part of that is security. With school shootings and the dangers to schools, those building capital issues come down to security, and putting all of that on a school, making them fund it by themselves when it's enforced, they have to do it by the state, that's tough. And as I was talking to Brian, one of the things that gets cut first and foremost is social services, and cutting back on mental health at a time when we need more mental health for students is really tough. And that's really hard on all of our faculty members at the different schools and also our administration. And we're putting unrealistic expectations on them. I'm running because I do believe in education. As an educator, it's near and dear to my heart. And quality and affordable education at all levels is absolutely necessary for achieving and making that American dream accessible. You know, whether you go to a four-year college or you go to a trade school, that's what gets you and keeps you in the middle class. And if we don't have that availability in New Hampshire, whether it's through our elementary schools, our high schools, or our college system, we need to make sure that our students for the next decades are put at a place where they can achieve what they need to achieve. And that starts with funding. And the definition of adequate and putting it all on property tax, there's other ways to do it, you know, and we need to get a little bit creative in finding new revenue sources. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And our the final candidate who's indicated he wishes to speak tonight is Eric Turner. So Eric, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks. So Eric Turner, running for Rockingham District 33. So that covers Brentwood, Danville, Fremont, which are in 3, of course, different school districts. So a lot to keep track of. So the way I've presented it when I've talked to folks is that, you know, in my mind, the only people that are in our towns that really have more to offer and to enrich our children than the teachers in our schools are the older residents. And this current system is literally pitting the seniors on fixed incomes that are trying to stay in their homes that they've been in, maybe some of them since before we were born, against the young families that are moving in and seeking good educations. Number one issue that I've heard going door to door back when we used to do that, and it feels like it's really tearing communities apart, so more than just hurting the education. And thanks for your presentation. I've seen it before, and it's very compelling. You know, I don't think most people really sort of think of things that way. You know, one of my towns, Danville, is featured as one of your presentations as a town that has particularly uneven and unfair burden, you know, even within the towns in their own district. So it's really eye-opening. And the other thing is the downshifting of costs to the towns from the state. gives this perception that the school budgets are ballooning out of control, when that's really not the main driver. And so it leads to these efforts to cut costs because there's no place else to diversify the revenue. And so, in my mind, that sort of sets up a negative feedback loop where, you cut the cost of your schools, now your property values get hurt, and it just makes the problem deeper. So I think you've already covered, I'm hoping we can deal with three things. I guess the total level of funding going to the schools, the share of that funding that is borne at the town versus by the state, and obviously the main driver, which is the fairness of the way the costs are shared. I want to throw one other thing out that I've talked about some with groups that I've been able to connect with, which is exploring the idea of expanding this program called the Low and Moderate Income Homeowners Tax Relief Program, which exists on the books and does tie what you pay to income in a way. It's currently sort of a meaningless program that doesn't offer any legitimate relief, but it's a vehicle that I'm hoping might be able to actually bring the progressivity down to the family level rather than just sort of addressing it uniformly at the town level. So, and I think that can hopefully be seen as, a way of doing sort of a bottom-up tax relief program electively as opposed to sort of something top-down. So anyway, really, really compelling, interesting conversation. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. So those are all the candidates who've registered who indicated they want to speak, but I think there are a few other folks who might be with us. And I want to give them an opportunity to speak if they are so interested. So if you'd like to just, either raise your hand physically or via the Zoom feature, we'll just pause for a second if you'd like to. I think we do have enough time to allow that. But seeing no takers, we'll turn to, actually, Ellen, would you like to speak?
It took me a minute to unmute. So I'm Ellen Douglas. I'm running for Rockingham 10, which is the Fremont. This is my very first time ever running for office, so I am learning a lot, but I am a product of public education all the way from kindergarten all the way through my master's at UNH, and even one could argue my PhD at Tufts was paid for by an EPA grant, so that you could argue that's public funding as well. So I am a big proponent of public education. And in talking to people in Fremont, the tax burden is the number one issue, as well as close second, keeping the rural character, so the low density of our rural town intact. And so that, really presents a conundrum, because if you want to increase your tax base, usually what you think of is you bring in more people, but that brings in more service requirements and stuff like that. So I think in my case, I'm an environmental scientist and I work with some planning people, and I'm hoping to be able to focus on other ways, innovative ways to increase the tax base in Fremont, like something called adaptive reuse and things like that. So clever ways, innovative ways to help bring in some amount of commercial tax base in a town like Fremont, which is a bedroom community, while maintaining our natural resources, which is a high priority for our town, and hopefully reducing the tax burden, or at least, reducing the increase of taxes in the town. So I've really appreciated hearing all your other thoughts. It seems like everybody's in the same boat, and hopefully we can convince some people we need to start thinking differently. We can't just do things the way we've always done them.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Is there anyone else who would like to speak who hasn't been recognized? All right, well, then we'll turn to delve a little bit deeper. We'll turn to a few questions. There's one that's been posed, and I'm going to see if that attendee is able to sort of pose that directly. Hang on just a second. Scott, would you like to ask the question that you had posed in the Q&A?
Sure. This is Scott Marion. I I'm the executive director of a nonprofit based in Dover called the National Center for the Improvement of Educational Assessment. We work in probably 35 states, including New Hampshire, on all sorts of assessment and accountability issues. So the issues of schools and schooling and funding and accountability are near and dear to my heart. I'm also on my local school board, on my local school board here in Rye, where we don't have a lot of these problems for 8 years. But I am really concerned about the inequities in the system because, like I said, I work, all throughout New Hampshire and nationally, and these are problems that are structural problems. And I understand the politics and the challenge of the politics of trying to talk about not taking the pledge or something like that, like Andrew just did. But I don't see how we solve major structural problems without posing major structural solutions. And if anybody has an idea, but we can't continue to run scared from dealing with the issue head on, because we're the worst, actually, we're one of the worst in the country in terms of education funding, in terms of proportion of funds from local compared to state funds. I think we're 49th or 50th, and that's just shameful.
Great, Scott, thank you so much for that question. Is there anybody who'd like to start off our conversation? Joshua, go ahead.
Yeah, Scott, bring up a great question, a great point. I forget who else brought up COVID and the impacts of that funding or potential funding and loss of revenues. But I truly believe we're facing a perfect storm. And I'll be super brief, but years ago, the town of Derry faced a huge budget battle with regards to the services they provide. Our first responders, fire stations, and employees were eliminated to save money. And my biggest fear is if we don't do something like what you're suggesting, Scott, some type of complete overhaul with how we do things, or come up with ways to create revenues, not only is Derry and the surrounding communities or struggling communities going to face real issues, but every state or every city and town across the state is going to face real issues. I mean, COVID projections, revenue losses are estimated between 325 and 500 million. We have $100 million rainy day fund, and where we're going to make that up just to make ends meet is beyond, it's a true problem. I believe in what I'm running on is that, and this is tough for me because I'm someone who just celebrated my 10-year anniversary in sobriety. So I don't take it lightly, but I believe we need to legalize, regulate, and tax cannabis and stop wasting our chances there. And with that money, we need to, I think Trish Todd brought up the lack of mental health funding, as well as our education funding problems. We should use a large portion of that to satisfy those needs. And I'm also running on the idea that we need to raise our net metering caps and expand renewable energy across the state. Cities and towns, the municipal side of things, and the schools should be allowed, incentivized to build solar fields that can eliminate their electric bills. And if they want to use that to help fund their education or that to help fund their capital improvement projects, that's great. If they want to use that to help reduce property taxes, that's great too. But these are two, what I consider shovel-ready, fiscally responsible answers to a pretty big problem coming our way.
Thank you so much.
Joshua, and congratulations on your anniversary, but thank you for at least
thank you.
Moving forward with some big ideas.
Is there anyone else? Trish, go ahead.
So I agree. I kind of ended on the fact of getting creative in some of those ways. I agree with Josh on the legalizing cannabis. It's not something that I would necessarily go out of my way to propose, but we are the only state in New England that hasn't legalized it. So we're like this little island not making any money. I'd like to see possibly using that like we use the liquor stores. We already have that infrastructure, maybe adding it to that and putting money towards fighting the drug crisis, but also education. And then e-cigarettes is another big one. I think those should be taxed and regulated a little bit more, and maybe that money, it's affecting schools. The e-cigarette thing is so bad in a lot of the schools, but maybe we could put a little bit of that money back into education, or all the money that we can pull from taxing those a little bit more. And increasing the price is going to help with keeping the kids from doing it, because if they can't afford it, they won't be able to buy it.
Thank you, Trish. Michael, I think you wanted to chime in. But you're muted still, Michael.
There we go. Yeah, I'm sorry, but I have to disagree. I know this is very unpopular. I have to disagree with the rush to legalize and tax cannabis. There is no free lunch. It does pose problems in many cases. I happen to know something about this. And I have to tell you also that we make a lot of money off alcohol. We have the liquor stores that you mentioned. We get a lot of money from the sale of the meals and rentals tax, because most of the money in restaurants is made selling alcohol. And we have an alcohol fund that we've never fully, we're supposed to put 5% of net profits from the liquor store in there. We've done it once. So I can't really see us mitigating the problems that we're going to have with increased drug use. With marijuana does sometimes lead to other drugs. It leads to sort of distorting and de-incentivizing yourself if you're trying to do something else and all you want to do is smoke marijuana. Ask me how I know. So it has consequences. It's not a free ride, and it's not that much money, and it doesn't get rid of the illegal market, because here in New Hampshire, you know, we don't like to pay taxes. So why would you leave your regular dealer and go down the street and pay tax? It's just not going to be what people sell it to be.
Thank you, Michael. Are there other folks? Diane, you'd like to weigh in?
Yeah, I would, not on that conversation, but on another avenue. This is just something that I've heard years ago, and I would like to learn more, dig more into it. But there was an increase in the rooms and meals taxes a number of years ago that was supposed to be fully earmarked for additional school funding. But those funds have been siphoned off and being redirected to other state projects like road work, construction, infrastructure, that kind of a thing. So I'd be interested in looking at, again, finding out why those funds have been redirected, pulling them back into their stated principle for when they were voted on for additional school funding. But it also brings up an additional aspect of bringing in more tourism and finding revenue from tourism, because it brings money into the state, but not full-time resident bodies. So they don't increase the need for more schools, they don't increase the need for more state and local services, but they do bring in a lot of revenue. So I think that's another area to look at and exploit, especially as we've seen during the world of COVID. We've had a lot more traffic coming in for those natural kind of resources where you can kayak and hike, and taking advantage of that. So I think that's another avenue for great revenue generation without the additional residency situation causing the increase of services that go along with that.
Thank you. Are there other folks who'd like to offer a few ideas? Donna?
So living on a border town in Salem, I think, going back to the cannabis, all surrounding towns around us in Massachusetts all have shops that can do this. I think we can't, we need to look at that and have that more of as revenue, because if anything, New Hampshire's prices are going to be less than Massachusetts anyway. So that's how that would work. When you go with cigarette tax, which I had heard that, and I need to look at this, cigarette taxes do not go up that often. I think that needs to be looked at, because again, being a border town, we sell cigarettes by the carton here. And one last thing is the vaping. Because Massachusetts stopped selling vape products and they stopped selling menthol cigarettes. Honestly, we just heard this last week from Patty Lovejoy. The taxes that we get on those products now it's increasing, which is awful because people are smoking more and they're using vaping more. But we're getting more tax revenue off of those products because Massachusetts stopped allowing vaping and they stopped selling menthol cigarettes. So people are coming across the border. And the border towns, and I look at the border towns and I'm like, we're pretty much a vice profit type of town. You know, we're going to have gambling, you know, we have, and so it's like marijuana. What are you gonna do? So I do think it's a good form of revenue. I do think one of the things she talked about again was we expect so much on gas taxes. And she said, that's going down. That stream of revenue is going down because cars are becoming more efficient. They're becoming hybrids. They're becoming electric vehicles. So we can't rely on that piece of revenue either. So if you look at where we get revenue across the board, it all has to be brought into this century because we're so stuck in last century about how we make our money. And being a border town, I see it every weekend when we get inundated from mass people. Okay, that's all I have to say.
Great. If unless there's somebody who'd like to offer another thought on that question, we do. Oh, Ed, I see you raising your hand. Please go ahead.
Yes, please, may I? A couple things that I never even got to, but one small thought is I wonder if some of the not border towns, the smaller communities, if they're near others, if they couldn't pool resources together to help make their ability to finance their education more efficient. That would be just one small thought. Another thought is that we depend very much on businesses, and I appreciate what Michael had to say about it, partnering with them, that we need to spend more time on a broader basis getting our state to look to encourage businesses to come in here or to start up businesses. That's where a lot of the property rich towns are. They have businesses to help supply the taxes. And if these smaller towns, if we could encourage businesses to come in, they would help on some of the finances for this. As far as marijuana, I mean, I'm at an age where I'm totally against it, but I realize that someday it's going to be legal. But I really don't think it should be legal until there is an adequate and legal test for determining a person's sobriety for driving and other things, because until that test is around, the roads are not going to be safer. But why would you want to encourage marijuana when we're talking about education, and that's something that messes the mind up and doesn't increase their ability to learn?
Thank you so much, Ed. We do have one other question that's come in, and I want to try to get to that before our time expires. This comes from Ben Levitt, and I'll paraphrase it. But if you were elected to office, how would you propose safeguarding school funding initiatives from any future siphoning, sort of as the state encounters financial difficulties? Is there anyone who might have a perspective on that question?
Can you repeat it, please?
Sure. The person who posed the question wanted to know what ideas folks might have, should they be elected to office, for protecting school funding initiatives from any kind of future siphoning. So that if the state encounters a financial crisis, say for instance, it won't be able to sort of rescind those commitments.
Well, and I'll chime in on that. I think that we need to hold the state accountable so that if we pass legislation where something is voted on specifically for to be used for school funding, and that's what they're saying now about the meals, the room and meals tax, is that there needs to be accountability on why that happened, because it's going directly against the will of the people and their representatives who enacted that legislation. So I think that there needs to be, cases taken up with the courts that say, that this was not done legally, especially if a tax is imposed or increased specifically for a particular use, whether it's school funding or anything else.
Any other thoughts, Michael? I see you there. I do want to give anybody who hasn't chimed in yet a chance to offer a thought or two. Aaron Spencer, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you. I think and this is coming from a first-time candidate, and I'll be honest, I think probably the naive answer, but I think the reality is when you put the legislation and you write those pieces into it, that this money can't be used for any other purpose. What is the recourse if it is, you know, if someone at the top one day tries to use it for some other purpose, that there is a process to be followed, that they can't, or that there is recourse to go there. So, I mean, it sounds like a simple answer, but I think that's, you know, I think that maybe is something that was overlooked in the past, kind of, from the thought of, well, they won't do that, they've agreed to it. But I think we now have that precedent that somebody did go the route, so we kind of have to just write it in there in future, to any future funding we legislate.
Rebecca, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think we've had a lot of really good thoughts here tonight, that I think a piece of this is continuing to work with our federal delegation to communicate to them, you know, what the school funding needs are. I know there's already been some inconsistency for schools in terms of what's going to get reimbursed with CARE Act funds, and that's created a lot of uncertainty in the schools in our district. So, you know, just being able to, I think, advocate for them and make sure that the costs that they are incurring that are unusual this year are made clear, that those need to be included in our state budget, and where we can find federal fundings to supplement our state budget, that will be an important piece of this.
Thank you. Michael, I think you had your hand raised, and then we'll turn to Ed.
Okay, I've just completed my 4th term, and there's a word called notwithstanding. And if you've heard Patty Lovejoy do her taxes 101, you've heard that word, because we'll make a law, we'll say we're going to do something, and then, you know, plan the budget, and it'll be notwithstanding whatever we said before, we're going to do this now. And I'm afraid that happens too often. Earlier, I posted a link to an article by Gary Reno, who's covered the State House for a long time. It's about the 30-year struggle to deal with education funding. So I'm hoping that, you know, you will all be elected, and that we can make something different happen, and that the budget hole isn't quite as big as it's been predicted, and that we can find a change. And I know that if the commission recommends legislation, it won't take effect until the following year. So maybe things will brighten. But as far as putting something in a lockbox, I don't think there is such a thing. I know that as far as the federal, a constituent has brought up to me that the Congress made a commitment to pay 40% of the cost of special ed, and they've never done it. So it's just something that kind of goes with the territory. The New Hampshire legislature is not immune to funding games. Very sorry though, and I wish you all well.
Ed, I think you'll get the last word on this question.
Yes, notwithstanding, it's up to the legislature to solve the problem for education. It's not up to the courts, and it has to be the legislature that actually makes the law that tries to solve it. And it's up to the people that elect the legislature to keep track of what's going on, to check on them, and to let them know their thoughts. Now, getting to how do you know something won't change? How do you know we won't pass something to solve the problem, and then we won't stick to it? Well, there goes that word notwithstanding again. It's up to the people who elect the legislature to keep track of what's going on. And if something is done, and it has been done in the past where they designated money to go someplace and then it didn't stay there. If something is being done that removes the funding that should be for education or for something else, it's up to the people to elect the legislature to keep track of what's going on and to make their voice heard to these legislatures and give them their adequate thoughts and thinking on this, and let them know we don't want you to do that.
Terrific. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up for the evening. I do want to remind folks, again, my name is Jeff McLynch, and I am the project director of the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project. If you've been interested in tonight's conversation or want to learn more about us as an organization, we also have some resources geared towards the commission. I do encourage you to check out our website, which is fairfundingnh.org. Please feel free to email us at any time at info@fairfundingnh.org. And you can also follow us on Twitter at fairfundingnh. And I really just want to extend my thank you to everyone who was part of this event tonight. I think it was a really fantastic give and take. And I really especially want to extend my gratitude to Dan for offering his perspective, for really all of you for your time and for your interest in trying to address these problems and serve the people of New Hampshire. So with that, I'll bring everything to a close. I do want to mention actually one last item. We will be sending around a link from tonight's event so everybody can sort of look at their remarks and get them tuned up for the campaign trail if you like. But we'll also, I'll also include the slides that I presented so that you have those as a reference. And so with that, I'll bring everything to a close and say thank you. And that way you get a chance to have a little breather before tonight's main event. So thank you all for being a part tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Folks, bye.